The summer of 1914 saw a continent march to war with a shared tragic delusion that it would all be over by Christmas. The great powers of Europe, entangled in a web of alliances and driven by imperial ambitions, unleashed their armies with the confident expectation of a swift, decisive conflict. The prevailing military doctrines were relics of the 19th century, romanticizing the heroic charge and the war of maneuver. But the industrialization that had reshaped their societies had also transformed the face of battle. The Great War, as it would come to be known, would not be a short, glorious affair. Instead, it would descend into a brutal, grinding stalemate, a war of attrition on an unprecedented scale. The armies that clashed on the Western Front soon found themselves ensnared in a seemingly unbreakable network of trenches that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. Here, the very technologies that were supposed to deliver swift victory, machine guns and rapid-firing artillery, created a killing ground where frontal assaults became exercises in mass suicide. The land between the opposing trenches, a desolate and cratered wasteland, aptly named No Man's Land, became a symbol of the war's futility. For years, the front lines barely moved, and the cost of gaining a few hundred yards of mud could be measured in tens of thousands of lives. It was in this crucible of static warfare, this seemingly endless cycle of slaughter, that the seeds of innovation were sown. The desperate need to break the deadlock spurred a period of intense technological and tactical development, a series of breakthroughs that would not only decide the outcome of the war, but also fundamentally reshape the nature of conflict and society itself for generations to come. This is the story of those breakthroughs, the desperate gambles, the flashes of genius, and the grim necessities that dragged warfare into the modern age. The Iron Beasts, the dawn of armored warfare. The stalemate on the Western Front was a direct consequence of the dominance of defensive firepower. Machine guns, capable of firing hundreds of rounds per minute, could scythe down attacking infantry with terrifying efficiency. Barbed wire, strung in dense thickets across no man's land, channeled attackers into kill zones. To break through this formidable defensive line, a new kind of weapon was needed, one that could cross the shell-pocked earth, crush barbed wire, and withstand the hail of machine gun fire. The answer, born out of a desperate need for a breakthrough, was the tank. The development of the tank was a closely guarded secret, particularly by the British. Early proponents, like Lieutenant Colonel Ernest Swinton, with the backing of Winston Churchill, who was then the First Lord of the Admiralty, championed the idea of an armored landship. To maintain secrecy, the vehicles were referred to in factories as water carriers or tanks, a name that would stick. The first prototype, nicknamed Little Willie, was constructed in 1915, and by early 1916, the more advanced Mark I tank was demonstrated to the British Army. These early tanks were ponderous, unreliable machines. They were slow, with a top speed barely faster than a walking soldier, and prone to mechanical breakdowns. The conditions for the crew inside were hellish. The engine fumes, the deafening noise, and the intense heat made them almost unbearable. Yet, for all their flaws, they represented a revolutionary concept in warfare. The first use of tanks in battle came on September 15, 1916, during the Battle of the Somme. The appearance of these iron beasts had a profound psychological impact on the German soldiers. However, their initial deployment was plagued with problems. Of the 49 tanks sent to the Somme, only a handful made it across no man's land to the German lines. They were rushed into combat before the designs were fully mature and were deployed in insufficient numbers to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Despite this inauspicious debut, the potential of the tank was clear. The British and French continued to refine their designs. The French, in particular, would go on to produce more tanks than all other nations combined, with their Renault FT being a particularly influential design. The Mark IV, the most common British tank of the war, saw action at the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917, the first time tanks were used in a massed assault. Here, over 400 tanks, as part of a combined arms attack, punched a significant hole in the formidable German Hindenburg Line, demonstrating that the stalemate could indeed be broken. Though this breakthrough was not fully exploited, Cambrai marked a turning point in the history of warfare, proving the tank's potential to restore mobility to the battlefield. Germany, which had initially been dismissive of tank technology, was forced to belatedly develop its own anti-tank weapons and a small number of its own tanks, such as the A-7V. The tank was not a war-winning weapon on its own in the Great War, but it was a crucial component in the development of a new form of warfare that would come to dominate the 20th century: combined arms. The integration of tanks with infantry, artillery, and aircraft would ultimately provide the key to unlocking the trenches and ending the bloody stalemate. The war in the air, from reconnaissance to dogfights. At the dawn of the First World War, the airplane was a novelty, a fragile contraption of wood, wire, and cloth. Invented just over a decade earlier, its military potential was largely unproven. Initially, aircraft were used for the same purpose as tethered observation balloons, reconnaissance. From their vantage point high above the trenches, pilots and observers could photograph enemy positions, map trench systems, and direct artillery fire with unprecedented accuracy. This aerial intelligence proved invaluable. During the Battle of the Marne in 1914, for example, reconnaissance from the Royal Flying Corps provided crucial information that allowed the British and French to counter the German advance. As the war progressed, the role of aircraft rapidly evolved. The desire to deny the enemy the advantage of aerial reconnaissance led inevitably to air-to-air combat. Early encounters were often comical, with pilots exchanging waves or brandishing pistols and rifles. But the grim reality of war soon demanded more effective solutions. The development of machine guns synchronized to fire through the propeller arc without shattering the blades was a pivotal moment. This innovation, pioneered by the Dutch engineer Anthony Fokker for the Germans, transformed the airplane into a deadly weapon. The era of the dogfight was born, and the skies above the Western Front became a new and terrifying battlefield. A new breed of hero emerged, the ace, a pilot who had shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft. Names like Germany's Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, became household names, their exploits celebrated as modern-day knights of the air. Beyond the dramatic duels of the fighter races, aircraft took on other vital roles. 2-seater planes were developed for bombing missions, initially with the observer literally dropping bombs by hand. Later, specialized bombers were designed, capable of carrying larger payloads and striking strategic targets behind enemy lines, such as factories and railway lines. Germany, in particular, pioneered strategic bombing with its Zeppelin airships and later its Gotha and Giant bombers. While the strategic impact of these early bombing campaigns was limited, they foreshadowed the devastating air raids of future conflicts and brought the war home to civilians in a new and terrifying way. Anti-aircraft weaponry also saw significant development in response to the growing threat from the air. By the end of the war, aircraft had become an indispensable part of any modern army. The Royal Air Force, formed in 1918, became the world's first independent air force, a testament to the growing importance of air power. The frail curiosities of 1914 had been forged in the crucible of war into sophisticated fighting machines, laying the foundation for the central role that air power would play in all subsequent conflicts. The chemical scourge, the horrors of gas warfare. Of all the new weapons unleashed during the Great War, none was more feared or more reviled than poison gas. Its use represented a new and terrifying dimension of industrial warfare, a scientific torture that inflicted agonizing suffering and had a profound psychological impact on soldiers. The first large-scale use of lethal chemical weapons occurred on April 22, 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres. The German army released a cloud of chlorine gas against French colonial and Canadian troops. The greenish-yellow cloud, smelling of bleach and pineapple, drifted across no man's land and settled into the Allied trenches. The effects were devastating. Chlorine gas attacks the respiratory system, causing a slow and painful death by asphyxiation. Panicked and unprotected, the Allied soldiers fled, creating a massive gap in the line. The Germans, themselves surprised by the effectiveness of their new weapon, failed to fully exploit the opportunity. The attack at Ypres opened a Pandora's box. Both sides quickly developed their own chemical arsenals and the means to deliver them, including artillery shells and specialized projectors. A deadly race of innovation ensued, with chemists on both sides developing ever more potent and insidious gases. Phosgene, deadlier than chlorine, was introduced by the Germans in late 1915. It was particularly insidious because its effects could be delayed, with soldiers who seemed fine initially succumbing to pulmonary edema hours later. But the most infamous chemical weapon of the war was mustard gas, first used by the Germans in 1917. A blistering agent, it caused severe chemical burns on contact with the skin, eyes, and respiratory tract. The initial symptoms were often delayed, and by the time irritation began, it was too late to decontaminate. While the mortality rate from mustard gas was relatively low, the horrific injuries it caused, including blindness and debilitating respiratory problems, left survivors scarred for life, both physically and psychologically. The introduction of poison gas led to the rapid development of countermeasures, most notably the gas mask. As the war progressed and gas masks became more effective, the tactical utility of chemical weapons diminished. However, the psychological terror they inspired remained potent. The mere threat of a gas attack forced soldiers to wear their cumbersome and claustrophobic masks, which severely hampered their ability to fight. In total, chemical weapons are estimated to have caused over 1 million casualties during the war, with nearly 100,000 fatalities. The public outrage of the use of poison gas was so profound that it led to the signing of the Geneva Protocol in 1925, which prohibited the use of chemical and bacteriological weapons in warfare. Though this ban has been violated on numerous occasions since, the horrors of gas warfare in the Great War remain a stark reminder of the brutal potential of scientific innovation when applied to the art of killing. The war at sea. U-boats, and the battle for the Atlantic. While the land war in Europe was defined by the stalemate of the trenches, a different kind of battle was being fought on the high seas, a battle for control of the vital supply lines that sustained the Allied war effort. The protagonist in this deadly maritime drama was a new and potent weapon, the German submarine, or U-boat. At the outset of the war, submarines were a relatively new technology, and their primary role was seen as attacking enemy warships. The German U-boat fleet made its presence felt early on, sinking several British cruisers in the opening months of the war. However, as the British Royal Navy imposed a tight blockade on Germany, cutting off its access to essential supplies, German naval strategy shifted. They would use their U-boats to wage a campaign of commerce raiding against Allied and neutral shipping, aiming to starve Britain into submission. In February 1915, Germany declared the waters around the British Isles a war zone, and its U-boats began a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking merchant ships without warning. This was a direct violation of international prize rules, which required warships to stop and search merchant vessels and ensure the safety of the crew before sinking them. The sinking of the British passenger liner RMS Lusitania in May 1915, which resulted in the deaths of nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans, sparked international outrage and put immense pressure on Germany. Faced with the threat of the United States entering the war, Germany temporarily suspended unrestricted submarine warfare. However, after the inconclusive Battle of Jutland in 1916, Germany once again turned to its U-boats in a final, desperate gamble to win the war. Unrestricted submarine warfare was resumed in February 1917, and the results were devastating. In the first few months, U-boats sank over 500 merchant ships, bringing Britain to the brink of collapse. The Allies struggled to counter the U-boat menace. However, the introduction of several key countermeasures turned the tide. The most effective of these was the convoy system, where merchant ships traveled in large, protected groups escorted by warships. The development of new anti-submarine weapons, such as the depth charge and early forms of sonar, then known as ASDIC, also increased the effectiveness of the escorts. Furthermore, extensive minefields, like the North Sea mine barrage, were laid to restrict U-boat movements. The German gamble ultimately failed. The resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare was a key factor in the United States' decision to declare war on Germany in April 1917, bringing its immense industrial and military might to the Allied side. By the end of the war, the U-boat threat had been neutralized. The German U-boat campaign had sunk nearly 5,000 ships, but it had not been enough to break the Allied supply lines.
Been won by the Allies, but the experience would provide valuable lessons for the even larger and more deadly submarine campaign that would be fought in the Second World War.
Breaking the deadlock on the ground, the evolution of tactics.
The static, attritional nature of trench warfare demanded a fundamental rethink of infantry and artillery tactics. The suicidal massed infantry charges of 1914 and 1915 had to be replaced with more sophisticated methods that could overcome the defender's advantage. This led to a tactical revolution on both sides of the conflict. One of the most significant developments was the shift in the role of artillery. Initially used for preliminary bombardments aimed at destroying enemy trenches, artillery proved to be a blunt and often ineffective instrument. These massive bombardments churned up the battlefield, making it even more difficult for the attacking infantry to advance, and often failed to destroy the deep German dugouts. A new approach emerged, the creeping barrage. This involved a line of artillery fire that moved forward at a set pace, just ahead of the advancing infantry, providing a curtain of cover and suppressing enemy machine gunners. The creeping barrage required precise timing and coordination between the artillery and infantry, and when executed effectively, it could be a powerful tool for breaking into enemy lines. Infantry tactics also underwent a profound transformation. The large, unwieldy battalions of 1914 gave way to smaller, more flexible units at the platoon and section level. These small units were equipped with a wider range of weaponry, including grenades, rifle grenades, and light machine guns like the Lewis gun, giving them greater organic firepower. The emphasis shifted from massed assaults to infiltration tactics, where small groups of highly trained soldiers, or stormtroopers, as the Germans called them, would probe for weak points in the enemy's line, bypass strong points, and attack the rear areas, creating confusion and disrupting the defense. The Brusilov offensive on the Eastern Front in the summer of 1916 showcased the effectiveness of new tactical approaches. General Alexei Brusilov, in a departure from traditional Russian tactics, opted for a short, intense artillery bombardment followed by a surprise infantry assault on a wide front. This was designed to catch the Austro-Hungarian forces off guard and prevent them from shifting reserves to threatened sectors. The initial attack was a stunning success, with Russian shock troops breaking through the enemy lines and inflicting massive casualties. While the offensive ultimately stalled due to logistical problems and a lack of reinforcements, its innovative tactics had a significant impact and were studied and adopted by other armies. The culmination of these tactical developments was the combined arms approach that came to characterize the final year of the war. This involved the close coordination of infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft in a unified battle plan. The 100 Days Offensive, which began with the Battle of Amiens in August 1918, was a masterclass in combined arms warfare. A surprise attack led by hundreds of tanks, supported by a creeping barrage and overwhelming air superiority, shattered the German lines. The Black Day of the German Army, as it was called by General Ludendorff, marked the beginning of the end for the Central Powers. The relentless series of Allied offensives that followed, utilizing these sophisticated combined arms tactics, pushed the German army back and ultimately led to the armistice in November 1918. The stalemate had finally been broken, not by a single miracle weapon, but by a revolution in military thought and practice.
The unseen enemy, medical breakthroughs in the face of unprecedented casualties. The industrial scale of the slaughter and the Great War presented an unprecedented challenge to the medical services of all the combatant nations. The sheer number of casualties and the horrific nature of the wounds inflicted by modern weaponry overwhelmed the existing medical infrastructure and forced a period of rapid innovation.
One of the most critical challenges was the treatment of massive blood loss on the battlefield. While blood transfusions had been performed before the war, they were rare and risky due to the lack of understanding of blood types and the difficulty of storing blood. The war spurred crucial advances in this area. The discovery of how to store blood for longer periods using sodium citrate, pioneered by doctors like Albert Huston, was a major breakthrough. This led to the establishment of the first blood banks, allowing for the life-saving transfusion of blood to be performed much closer to the front lines. The war also saw the birth of modern plastic surgery. The devastating facial injuries caused by shrapnel and bullets left many soldiers horrifically disfigured. Surgeons like Sir Harold Gillies, working at specialized hospitals like Queen's Hospital and Sidcup, pioneered new techniques for skin grafting and facial reconstruction, working to restore not just function, but also a sense of identity to their patients. His groundbreaking work laid the foundations for the field of plastic surgery as we know it today. Flat perspective. The figures and objects lack realistic depth and are depicted in a relatively flat, two-dimensional manner, characteristic of pre-Renaissance art. The war also highlighted the importance of rapid evacuation of the wounded from the battlefield. The establishment of battlefield aid stations closer to the fighting and the widespread use of volunteer ambulance drivers significantly increased a soldier's chances of survival. The triage system, which categorized casualties based on the severity of their injuries to prioritize treatment, was also refined and implemented on a large scale. Furthermore, the development of mobile X-ray units, championed by figures like Marie Curie, allowed surgeons to locate bullets and shrapnel within a soldier's body, making surgery more precise and less invasive. In a grim irony, the use of poison gas, which demonstrated how synthetic chemicals could kill living cells, inadvertently led to the development of chemotherapy for cancer treatment in the post-war years. The medical lessons learned in the brutal school of the Great War had a profound and lasting impact. The advances in trauma care, surgery, blood transfusion, and medical organization not only saved countless lives during the conflict, but also laid the groundwork for many of the practices and technologies that are central to modern civilian healthcare. The medical lessons learned in the brutal school of the Great War had a profound and lasting impact. The advances in trauma care, surgery, blood transfusion, and medical organization not only saved countless lives during the conflict, but also laid the groundwork for many of the practices and technologies that are central to modern civilian healthcare. Flat perspective. The figures and objects lack realistic depth and are depicted in a relatively flat, two-dimensional manner, characteristic of pre-Renaissance art. The breakthroughs of the First World War were born of necessity. The tank, the combat aircraft, the U-boat, and poison gas were all developed in an effort to break the horrific stalemate of trench warfare. The evolution of military tactics, from the suicidal massed assaults of the early war to the sophisticated combined arms operations of 1918, was a direct response to the changing realities of the industrial battlefield. And the remarkable advances in medicine were driven by the urgent need to save the lives of the millions who fell victim to this new form of mechanized warfare.
The legacy of these breakthroughs is complex and often contradictory. The technologies and tactics that helped to win the war also ushered in an era of even more destructive conflict. The tank and the airplane would become the cornerstones of the blitzkrieg that unleashed the Second World War. The strategic bombing of cities, first trialed in the Great War, would reach its horrific apotheosis in the fire bombings of Dresden and the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The U-boat campaigns of the First World War were a dress rehearsal for the even more desperate Battle of the Atlantic in the Second.
But the innovations of the Great War also had positive and far-reaching consequences. The development of aviation and radio communication helped to connect the world in new ways. The advances in medicine, from blood transfusions to plastic surgery, have saved and improved the lives of countless millions in the century since the war's end. The war also acted as a catalyst for profound social and economic change. The mass mobilization of societies for total war led to the expansion of government power, the entry of women into the workforce on a large scale, and the acceleration of industrial production.
The First World War was a watershed moment in human history, a violent and traumatic birth of the modern age. The breakthroughs that emerged from its crucible of conflict are a testament to the strange and often brutal interplay between war, technology, and society. They serve as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity's capacity for ingenuity, for both creation and destruction, knows no bounds. The world we live in today was, in many ways, forged in the fires of the Great War, shaped by the breakthroughs that were intended to win a war, but ended up changing the world.